here on purpose. I was offered 5 hours to come work here in the library, and I jumped on it. And when all of the students were sending me home intellectually exhausted, I knew that this is the place where I belonged, and none of that has changed. I'm going to talk to you, this is a lecture that I give in different classes and different variations. So it's about 20 minutes, and we're going to talk about the roots of banned and challenged books. Banned and challenged children's and young adults. You know, you can look at the banning and challenging of young adult and children's books as a real heat map about what's happening socially and politically in our country. And what's happening now isn't really different than what has happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. People have been banning, challenging, or outright burning books for a really long time. Of course, what we're seeing now is far more organization and funding, which makes it a lot more powerful. And all of these bans are about identity, and the identities that are frightening to people. If I have any public speaking faculty in the room, I'm going to disappoint them by looking at my notes. And Christy Fierro's not here. She's very disappointed in me. Well, welcome. This is my banned and challenged children's and young adult literature. And I call it the struggle for young people's minds. Not my quote, we'll get into that later. I'm one of your library faculty here at Tacoma Community College. Beautiful place to be a librarian. Please feel free to contact me and ask me questions during if you want. But let's just start with the value. I want to start with the value and purpose of storytelling as a part of our humanity. I want to acknowledge our storytelling heritage that precedes and parallels storytelling in print. Storytelling, whether oral or in print, entertains, instructs, preserves history, and passes down culture. So as we proceed with this lecture, keep in mind that our storytelling heritage carries significance and consequence for us. Reflect on your own oral storytelling, your family, and other social structures you have in your life. I remember in my family, the oral storytelling came out when electricity went out. And I got to learn all about the stuff that my dad did as the middle child of 11 children. So oral storytelling had a big influence in my life as well. When we approach the history of children's literature, we need to acknowledge the Western influence on children's literature, its beginnings, its trajectory. It has profound impact on how children's literature looked 120 years ago at its first development and how it looks now. In the mid-1400s, we have William Claxton of England, and he developed the first successful mass commercial printing machine. Commercial being different from what we had seen prior to that. And this is where print children's literature has its roots. I always like to point out how significant this development was, as Claxton closely resembled this less dramatic rendering. But you know, again, we all have our stories. But going back even further, so it took us a long time as a civilization to realize that children are not simply small adults. This is significant. At around 300 BCE, the first recorded set of ideas about the nature of babies and children came from Aristotle, who hypothesized that there is a tiny human contained within each sperm, and that the uterus is nothing more than one lucky contestant's incubator. The fetus is thought to be a tiny adult human, waiting to grow into a full-size adult. And childhood, rather than being a time of profound cognitive and physiological development, was simply the time it took for that small adult to grow into a large one. And I have a point. At the time of the first mass commercial printing of books, and really until about the 1900s, books were not specifically made for children. In part because the notion of children as being small adults is still sticking even at this time. Easy readers, such as Aesop's fables, became very popular with children. Children probably adopted these stories as their own because of the talking animals, which is developmentally appropriate. And adults probably embrace them for their children because the stories are moral lessons. Storytelling and social instruction. Around the turn of the 20th century, books began to be made specifically for children. Among the upper middle class in Victorian England, who were the drivers of the popular economy, those who could purchase books, children were often under the complete care of nannies and private tutors. Childhood was romanticized, and protecting yet objectifying it became big publishing business. Books about adventure are popular, and books with moral and cautionary tales are popular also. Little Lord Fauntleroy is a maudlin English novel about a child of pure heart. It was a runaway bestseller, and it even sparked a fad in children's fiction. Some lessons in books were a little less frilly, and some more direct. This is German, and this is Shock-Headed Peter. And he is warning, or we're receiving warnings on his behalf, that if they don't maintain good hygiene, no one will even want to be near them. Anything to me is sweeter than to see Shock-Headed Peter. I don't know how his toenails are doing in those shoes, but question for another time. The meaning of reading for children has evolved from all of these early ideas of childhood and how best children should grow into these full-size adults. Reading is education. And it became tightly tied to formal education, and to the extent that all reading should educate. For example, not that long ago was a pretty raging controversy among both educators and families. It went on that debated the merits of reading materials that reluctant readers were more likely to engage with, such as comic books. It isn't real reading if it's not learning. Humans are the products of our ideologies. Language is what helps us participate in life and understand ourselves within those ideologies. And reading and literature play major roles as the tools of language. So, understanding our ideologies is important in understanding the history and role of literature for children. The content of children's literature is representative of the adult struggle for young people's minds within our preferred ideology. The topics, plots, attitudes, and messaging in children's literature and our reaction to children's literature are telling of what we value and what we fear at any given time. First, let's do a definition of what we mean by a challenge versus a book ban. A challenge is an attempt to remove or restrict materials based upon the objections of a person or group. And a ban is a successful challenge. From the ALA, American Library Association, in 2025, 92% of all book challenges in the U.S. are initiated by funded pressure groups and government and school officials who are swayed by those pressure groups. These efforts are often characterized as grassroots parent efforts, but as we saw in the documentary, in reality, only about 3% of challenges come directly from individual parents or other adults. These statistics include challenges to books and other materials that children would have access to in their school library, but it also spills over into public libraries as well. In 2025, over 4,000 unique titles were challenged, which is up significantly from the average of 275 unique challenges between 2001 and 2020. In 2025, over 5,500 books were completely banned across the US, with 40% of those books being about LGBTQ and BIPOC identity and lived experiences. For a while, ALA produced these handy word clouds, and I really want them to do this again because they're really telling. In 2021 were challenges, here's the last one they produced, again, which is really unfortunate because I actually do use them to teach with, where challenges citing sexually explicit material were in abundance, which is nothing new compared to 2015. But in 2021, we see that critical race theory and woke made their way into the lexicon of challenge attempts. We can think back to what was happening around that time to understand the cultural and political basis for those challenges. Note the accusations of grooming are just appearing in 2021, which brings us to 2026, where not just books, but librarians face the consequential and morally injurious accusation. It's important to point out that we often associate book challenges with traditionally conservative viewpoints. And while it is true that most challenges do spring from these viewpoints, challenges from traditionally liberal viewpoints do arise and are no less a censorship threat. So as we progress through the years, more and more books and other materials are challenged, and for more and different reasons. It begs the question, what hasn't or won't be challenged? I really enjoy this quote from Craig Lankto, who is a teacher and a journalist, and it's from their book, Banned Books. So we ask, what hasn't been challenged? And Lankto replies, very little, probably nothing worth reading. I will discuss two books that were famously challenged that we have up here, and offer some historical context around those challenges. First, let's look at Sylvester and the Magic Pebble. Has anybody read that book? It's pretty adorable.
Yes.
A little bit dark. This is a 1969 picture book by William Steig. So he's the author that did Shrek, the book that the movies were loosely based on. In short, Sylvester is a donkey child who accidentally and nearly permanently turns himself into a rock via the use of a magic pebble. Sylvester is missing. His bereft donkey parents search everywhere for Sylvester by first alerting the police. Soon after publication, the main challenge to this book came from the Chicago Police Department, who wanted it banned from area schools, libraries, and even bookstores because the police are depicted as pigs. This is a telling challenge at the time. I know. In the same year this book was published, it was an incredibly socially tumultuous time in the United States, 1969. The 1960s and 1970s saw an enormous amount of social change and protest. And these are images of newspaper articles from this time. So if you see some language in here that is something we wouldn't use today, that is why. So many of these protests in the 60s and 70s were anti-war or in support of Black American civil rights. This made the status quo power structure fearful and defensive. As opposed to the earlier civil rights movement messaging, High-ranking leaders of the Black Panthers suggested that violence was the only way to meet the violence against Black Americans, and that guns may be needed to bring the police or pigs into check. It is also during this time when government and police violence led to 6 deaths at Kent State and Jackson State colleges. There is a violence and tension stemming from a growing generational demand for social change and a disruption of the status quo. So Sylvester and Magic Pebble's depiction of the police as pigs had hit a sore spot in the law enforcement community. That challenge was largely not successful. But traveling further back in time, the last book I would like to discuss in the time that we have, because this could go on and on, is The Rabbit's Wedding by Garth Williams. This was published in 1958. It is exactly what it looks like. It's about 2 consenting rabbits. Boy, rabbits are taking a hard hit, aren't they? It's about 2 consenting rabbits, one black, the other white, and they get married among their friends in the forest. This book was subject to an infamous challenge in Alabama in 1958. First, before discussing the book, we need to understand a little about what was going on in America's South at that time. So let's go to Alabama. John Malcolm Patterson is Alabama governor at that time, from the time span in 1959 to 1963. Now, he defeated George Wallace, which is important to know about for later. During Patterson's 1958 campaign, which was endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan, he promises if a school is ordered to be integrated, it will be closed down. George Wallace was defeated by Patterson in 1958 because he was seen to be too soft on segregation policy. Wallace then came strong on upholding segregation law, and he marketed it with the catchier slogan, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, which won him the Alabama governorship in 1963. Wallace did his best to block the entry of Black American students to the University of Alabama, which was in direct violation of the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision to end segregation in public schools. It's also important to understand the legislative climate regarding segregation in Alabama at the time. The Alabama Penal Code read as follows of 1866. Marital and extramarital relationships between Negroes and white persons are punishable by 2 to 7 years of imprisonment. Not long after this, in 1910, Alabama doubles down with amendment to their actual constitution that prohibits any law in the future that would authorize or legalize any marriage between any white person and a Negro for a descendant of a Negro. Versions of these laws and amendments are present and upheld in southern U.S. states well into the 1960s. And Alabama itself did not remove that 1910 constitutional amendment until November 2000. Ultimately, rumblings of desegregation start to catch up with Alabama. And legislators and some citizens start targeting books that appear to support desegregation, which brings us back to The Rabbit's Wedding. In 1958, 4 years after Brown v. Board of Education, E.O. Edens, an Alabama state senator, claimed that Rabbit's Wedding was propaganda for integration and intermarriage. And this book, and others like it, should be taken off the shelves and burned. Enter the Librarians. Edens and the White Citizens Council of Montgomery, Alabama, took their anxiety and fear out on the Montgomery libraries and the librarians, including the head of purchases.
librarian Emily Wheelock Reed, accusing her of putting stock in racial incorporation, fancy way of saying validating and normalizing desegregation. And she did so by his reckoning by purchasing the Rabbit's Wedding for Montgomery Libraries. Reed herself couldn't understand what, quote, was all the fuss about two rabbits. The Rabbit's Wedding is a relatively famous case of one well-organized, well-funded book challenge symbolizing the fear and anxiety of a power base that accompanies a changing social structure. Wheelock was under immense pressure to remove the book from the entire Montgomery library system. She was questioned before the state legislature, she was questioned in court, and she risked both termination and library defunding. The state of Alabama, the city of Montgomery, and the white supremacist citizen leadership eventually recognized that Wheelock Reed was going to uphold her values as a librarian and the U.S. First Amendment. And she was going to do it for as long as it took. And they finally accepted a loaded compromise where Montgomery libraries would place the book among other materials deemed racially controversial. Here's a couple of biopic-style scripts. Wheelock Reed was not terminated, but soon after the conclusion of this incident, she left for Washington, D.C. in another public library position. And just an aside, in 2015, Wheelock Reed's story was adapted as a play by Kenneth Jones called Alabama Story. I've never seen that, but that would be kind of cool. Meanwhile, as Williams' 1958 book, The Rabbit's Wedding, is being challenged in Montgomery and elsewhere in the southern U.S., enter the case of Mildred and Richard Loving, a Virginia couple who traveled to Washington, D.C. to get legally married. Several weeks after returning to their home in Virginia, the Lovings are arrested in violation of Virginia law, Section 20-58 of the Virginia State Code, which prohibits a white person from marrying a colored person and leaving the state to do so. And you can't return to live as man and wife under those conditions, which was based on plenty of other laws prohibiting interracial marriages at that time. While their jail time was suspended, as they had, I think, 4 children by this time, Virginia ruled that the Lovings would have to leave the state and not return as a married couple for 25 years. They were banished from a U.S. state. The Lovings moved to Washington, D.C. and didn't just stay there and rest. They began a long legal battle against the state of Virginia, which eventually became Supreme Court case Loving v. Virginia, 1967, where the court ruled that states' laws prohibiting interracial marriage were in violation of our U.S. Constitution. While Sylvester and the Magic Pebble and The Rabbit's Wedding were not in any way written as social protest books, our reaction to any children's book is both a mirror and a window, thank you, Allison, into current political, social climates and changes. Generally, books do speak, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to social change, and then in backlash, challenges speak to our fears about those changes. In recent years, there are more books written by BIPOC authors, Black, Indigenous, and people of color than ever before, both for young adults and children, creating an additional way for BIPOC children to connect to, celebrate, explore, and solidify identity. And it's a way for all children to look in and begin to understand that not everyone navigates life in the same ways, and everyone's story and identity is worthy of sharing, valuing, and celebrating. Naturally, this creates discomfort for some people and some groups who feel threatened by highlighting BIPOC lived stories, identity, and anti-racist literature. And they challenge these books under the guise of protecting their children. However, this is more about the struggle for young people's minds and the preservation of power differentials in our society, which requires the suppression and erasure of some identities. There we go. All books and other media tell us something about what's happening culturally and socially. But children's and young adult books tell us the most in sharp relief about our changing culture and values and power structures. Our reactions to these books tell us something about ourselves as well. Always consider, in the face of challenges or bad attempts, or even talk about that, who or what is being protected and preserved. Always ask, who gets to decide what kinds of information is available to us? And I encourage you to reflect on your own experiences. What was one of the most influential books you read as a child? What is the nature of the gap that would have been left in your identity if you did not have access to that material? This is mine. The Fascinating World of Animals, which inspired me. It made me curious, it motivated me to read, and most important, gave me my sense of awe about the natural world, which I cherish. I checked this book out so many times from the library that my mom finally bought me a copy when I was 6. And I mean, come on. Seriously, this has stuck with me all these years. What isn't awe-inspiring about a golden mole? That looked, I just could not fathom this animal. It looked like a fuzzy corn nut. How is that possible? That is a living thing in our world that we can enjoy and just be amazed at. So while not every book sparks controversy, God, I hope not, the availability of this book to me from my local library helped me forge a part of my adult identity. So take a few moments and find someone near you and tell them about your most influential childhood book or other material.
Yeah, brother.
If anybody has any questions or comments, I would love to hear them. Otherwise, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the food. I had it in today. It was amazing.
You as well, take it easy.